I'm Rick Hasen. I'm a professor at UC Irvine School of Law, where I specialize in election law. I think the court not being on TV matters, but I don't think it is the decisive issue. Think about how the Supreme Court makes its decisions. Here's an argument, agrees to hear a case. Here's arguments a few months later, decision comes out a few months after that. The most important decisions all come out within a couple of days, maybe a week or two period at the end of June, usually. And those decisions are written in a language necessarily that is hard for the average person to understand. And so I think it's hard to make the connections between what the Supreme Court does and public policy. There's a decision that's made about affirmative action, a decision that's made about environmental law, and it has tremendous repercussions, but they're not obvious or immediate. And it's that lack of immediacy that I think matters. Rare counterexample, the same-sex marriage decision. I think that we saw pretty immediate effects. There were a whole bunch of states where what was illegal one day became legal the next. Why hasn't that had a greater effect? I think because for most people it turns out that whether people of the same gender are allowed to get married doesn't really have an effect on their lives day to day. But on lots of other decisions, there are great effects. For example, access to abortion. Great effects. Whatever side you're on that issue. Every day there are abortions going on. Every day those abortions are harder to get in certain states, like Texas, Mississippi. There have been challenges to these laws. That's having an effect, but it's happening every day to individual people, and it's just not as salient as an ISIS attack or the stock market tanking or something that just comes up in the news, like, for example, recently the problems with water contamination in Flint, Michigan. Right? So there are these bursts of things that help to define what's on the political agenda. The Supreme Court it doesn't operate in a way that usually lends itself to that kind of public reaction. And so I think it's harder to make it an issue in political campaigns. Well, on the social science itself, I think it's pretty clear that there's not a simple relationship between money and political outcomes. So, to take a current example, Jeb Bush running for president on the Republican side, his super PAC that's been spending in his favor has spent somewhere between $60 and $100 million trying to promote his candidacy. About $50 million of it, I understand, to make Jeb a more likable and attractive candidate. And it hasn't worked. And he's not the first example, which demonstrates that you can throw all the money in the world in advertising and people are not going to buy a product they otherwise don't want to buy. And so the social science evidence is not simply that money buys votes. But instead, what we do know is that money makes you viable. Money gives you, to take the example from the 2012 elections, and Newt Gingrich being supported by Sheldon Adelson, one of these large contributors to super PACs who contributed somewhere between $98 and $150 million with his wife in the 2012 elections. Money gives you additional chances to try to convince voters, especially in the case of Congress or in state legislatures or in local races. $1 million can have a much greater effect on electoral outcomes than on the presidency, where it's kind of overdetermined what's going on there. But we also know that it affects political outcomes. And so if you look at the policies that Congress enacts, they tend to reflect the preferences of the wealthy. They tend to reflect the views of those who are in power, those who can afford to hire lobbyists. And the lobbyists themselves engage in campaign finance activities to secure access to make their case. And so money gives you more chances to influence both electoral outcomes and policy outcomes. Now, what is the relationship between this social science evidence and the Supreme Court's decisions in these cases? I think there's very little relationship. I've argued, and the election law blog podcast that I did with Professor Pursley, I think underlines this point, that the Supreme Court's view of social science evidence tends to be the tail wagging the dog. That is, the court seems to come in with value judgments and points to social science evidence sometimes, but it doesn't seem to be controlling the outcome of cases. So let's take one example here on the basis for allowing campaign finance limits. The court has said not only can limits be justified on contributions to candidates to prevent corruption, but also the appearance of corruption. And the theory here is that if voters saw that candidates were getting large contributions, it would undermine their confidence in democracy, and this would create this appearance of corruption. Well, Professor Pursley and others, I point to also the work of Professor Milo and Primo, have shown that there's very little relationship between campaign contribution limits and the public's confidence in the electoral process. Other things drive public confidence in the process, trust in government. In part, people's economic conditions tends to drive those things. Yet the Supreme Court accepts, or has accepted somewhat uncritically, this idea that large donations could cause voters to think that there's corruption in the system. The court's never found enough evidence to justify a spending limit, enough evidence of corruption to justify a spending limit outside of that Austin case for corporations. It's always found, until the new set of cases under the Robbers Court, that there was enough evidence of corruption or the appearance of corruption to justify contribution limits. It seems instead to be a value judgment. Contribution limits are okay, spending limits are not, and any social science, pointing to any social science evidence, is just make weight for the value judgments made by the court based upon their pre-existing worldviews. So what can we do about the problem of money in politics? To begin with, certainly we could have better disclosure laws. Let me talk about what you could do within the realm of what the Supreme Court has already said. We certainly can have better disclosure laws. Disclosure laws that make it clear in every instance who's contributing money to affect the outcome of elections. And Congress won't do that on the federal level. There needs to be improvements. On the state and local level, things could be made better as well. Another thing that needs to be done is we need stronger rules against coordination, so that giving $1 million to a super PAC is not the same, or a 501c4 social welfare organization that doesn't disclose its donors should not be the same as giving the money directly to the candidate. Again, this is a problem of political will. It's a problem of the Federal Election Commission not creating better regulations. It's not a constitutional problem. There's also plenty of additional campaign finance laws that are being challenged on First Amendment grounds. There needs to be a defense of those laws. And so groups need to be in defensive mode. So short term, that can be done. Further, there can be public financing, especially I've argued in my book for campaign finance vouchers. I was very happy to see that Seattle is the first city to pass a voucher program. I'm anxious to see how that works out. And I think other novel ways of experimenting with small donor public financing is a good thing. Longer term, I think the project needs to be to change the Supreme Court. That is, there's only so much that can be done along the edges to try and improve public financing. It's going to take a new progressive Supreme Court majority willing to carefully balance not only anti-corruption interests, but also equality interests against the very legitimate First Amendment concerns that come up about free speech and association. We still need a balance, but we need a new balance, one which recognizes that we don't want to live in a plutocracy or an oligarchy. We want to live in a place where those with the greatest economic power can't take that power and have a much better chance of influencing the outcome of elections and politics than the rest of us.